thanks Eric for having us. The three of us are the hosts of the Female Bob Dylan podcast, and we're here with our friend Dr. Josie Wilkerson. We're going to talk about Hazel Dickens, but we thought we'd give a little intro to the podcast to start. So the title, The Female Bob Dylan, is tongue-in-cheek, it's a joke. And it started because we were realizing that many women musicians who are songwriters and who play guitar have often been subjected to this label and been called the female Bob Dylan. So each of our episodes generally looks at a single female musician and narrates her career and her work and the intentions of her work outside of this Dylan-esque comparison, I would say.
Anything you want to add? That sums it up pretty well. Just want to make sure you all can hear me. Okay, cool. Alright, I'll project.
You can also share this one.
I'll hop over.
Okay. So we're going to show this little trailer. We're going to show a trailer that our friend Andy edited for us. But we did some research into newspaper archives, historical newspaper archives, and found many instances of women musicians being called the female Bob Dylan. So we put together this.
Her unique treatment of soul and folk styles have since earned her the reputation of being a female Bob Dylan.
To put a label on it, she might almost be called a female Bob Dylan.
Feminine version of Dylan? She's 15 years old, and people are already calling her the female Bob Dylan.
Watch me consider and the female Bob Dylan to pop world. All I need to do is learn the guitar, and then I can easily become the female Bob Dylan.
He sat on the bench to listen. A female Bob Dylan, he said of her. And this is true.
Chronic Converse was, quote, the female Bob Dylan, end quote. Then she disappeared.
The history of the female Bob Dylan vanished without a trace.
Okay, so hopefully the slides will rotate on their own. As far as we don't know that Hazel Dickens has been called the female Bob Dylan, but in the spirit of the theme of the weekend, we wanted to talk about Hazel, especially since Alice was playing and doing a book talk. So we wanted to bring Hazel into the conversation as well. So Desi, do you want to start with kind of giving a little overview about Hazel and her life and work?
Sure. So first, let me just say I'm so excited to be here with the female Bob Dylan. This is my favorite podcast that's playing right now. So I highly recommend go back to you're on the second season, right? It's great listening. So I highly recommend, and then I always go listen to the music that they talked about. So it's really, really great. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Hazel Dickens. I think we learned some about her from Alice earlier today. We've got some folks in the room who I think knew Hazel, which is really cool to have you all in the room. So Hazel was born in 1925 in Mercer County, West Virginia, a very southern part of West Virginia. And I do want to note, and we'll talk about this some, that she always said publicly that she was born in 1935. Yeah, it's a great little detail about Hazel Dickens' life. She was 10 years older than what she publicly said. And so she was born to Sarah and H.N., her father, H.N. Dickens, and he hauled timber for the coal industry. and Sarah raised 11 children. And so from what we know from Hazel's interviews, there's a great documentary that Mimi Pickering did about Hazel Dickens' life. I highly recommend that as well. But we know that she had a pretty difficult childhood. H.N. did well for a while in his job hauling coal when the coal industry was booming, but then the coal industry, of course, starts to decline in the 1950s with automation. And the family starts, so some of the older siblings start to move to Baltimore. So they're following what people call the hillbilly highway to the city to work in factories. So her older siblings go to Baltimore. She leaves for the first time to go to Radford, Virginia when she's 16, maybe. It's always a little hard to know exactly how old she was when these things happen, but around, she's a teenager. She goes to Radford, Virginia, and she works in a textile mill. And then she goes back and forth to Baltimore and back home pretty regularly. She talks about those as very lean years. Her father was unemployed. He had a ruptured disc in his back. They were pretty destitute. She started school late because she was very sick as a child. So about the first 7 years of her life, she's constantly pretty ill. And then she quit school in the seventh grade. And talks about not having shoes and a coat to go to school. And so eventually she does go to Baltimore with her siblings, and she works all kinds of jobs. She's a nanny, or babysitter for her sister's kids. She's a waitress. She works in a couple of different factories. She ends up at Continental Continental Can Factory, which is a maker of beer cans. And it's a union job, so it's a really good job. And so in those same years, she also meets Mike Seeger. So her family is always playing music from the time she can remember. And they continue doing that in Baltimore. Her father was supposedly a great banjo player, and was also a preacher in the Primitive Baptist Church. And so she learned how to sing, what they call lining out songs, or singing a cappella in church services. And so her family's all playing music, and Mike Seeger meets one of her brothers, and they come over, or he invites him over for dinner, and he just really falls in love with the family and is really captivated by their musical style. And so he becomes a great friend of Hazel, of course, and of one of her brothers. So at that point in the 50s, Hazel starts going to all these house parties. I think as Alice explained, there were a ton of parties. They were just partying all the time. And there was music. And Hazel describes in one interview that on each floor there was a different style of music. So on the first floor, there was old time music. On the second floor was bluegrass music. On the third floor, there was country western. And so people would move around these floors and play music together. And of course, that's where she met Alice eventually. And so we can, I think, go from there and start to get into the music.
Well, should we think about her in terms of someone who is migrated, an Appalachian migrant woman? You want to start there? Or, okay. Well, yeah, I've been thinking about, we get in country music a lot of songs from the perspective of male Appalachian migrants to the cities, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore. But Hazel narrates the woman migrant experience. And I was working on another piece and really thinking about the honky tonk, and this scholar, Pamela Fox, basically says that the honky tonk was coded as this male space, like a masculine space in the city where male Appalachian migrants felt at home when it might be hostile in the city, and Hazel herself experienced some hostilities against hillbilly. She talks about seeing this sign, and she's trying to rent an apartment that says no dogs or hillbillies. And so the honky tonk is a place that male migrants could define as their own space. It's not their boss's space at the workplace. And it's also not the feminine space of the feminine coded space of the home. So Hazel, she was playing these house parties, but then she also starts playing in bands. She's like in a band, the Pike County Boys. She's like the only woman in playing bass.
Western wear.
Yes. She was a cute little cowgirl outfit. But she talks about being like relentlessly hit on in these bars, and it is not a space that is necessarily for women. And there's the archetype of the honky-tonk angel, which she went on to cover that Katie Wells song, Wasn't God Made Honky-Tonk Angels. So in that respect, I mean, she's really experiencing a lot of harassment, like being hit on by men in her own band. Yeah, I mean, she at one point says she's a survivor of the male-dominated bluegrass.
Yeah, she kind of takes these sorts of spaces and counterposes them to the house party scene that we were just introduced to. And yeah, I mean, it had us all thinking a little bit about like what the kind of possibilities for playing this kind of music were in this moment. There's like all these different house parties where genres sort of mixed. There are these like party spaces that seem both fun and like threatening, and then there's the folk festival stage, which she eventually moves out into, and which is no longer a party. There's like a little more separation between the stage and the people.
Yeah, she tells one story about the first festival that she and Alice went to in Galax, and they go on the stage. I guess you had to sign up to go on stage, and they're up there and they're singing 3 different songs. And Hazel says she's singing Little Bessie, she's singing a cappella, and this man in the audience starts yelling at her to sit down, to get on stage. And then one of the male musicians like rushes the stage and defends her and says to the guy, "You shut up and sit down. This girl can sing." And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of tensions and contradictions in those spaces. And so she constantly talks about how, at the end of the day, she just wanted to make music. And so she was putting up with a lot just because she was so moved by the music and so dedicated to making it.
And I think that also raises a question of genre. And we heard Alice just say, like it's for you folklorists to like figure out what those genres mean. But I think also for Alice, and I think a little bit for Hazel too, it was just music. I don't think there's like they're making these distinctions across genre, and that's also how like Alice perceived the anthology of American folk music. Like it's all culturally embedded music, what folklorists can even say. But it's all cultural music, and there's not distinctions that they're like necessarily drawing on. Is it old time? Is it bluegrass? Is it country? It's just music.
And you really do hear all of that in her music. I mean, that high lonesome sound, it's like you hear Roscoe Holcomb, and you also hear like Ola Bell Reed, like we talked about earlier. Such a beautiful voice. And I feel like one thing that was cool about putting this slideshow together, which when we air this as a podcast, nobody will be able to see it, but you can see it, is I feel like you can almost see what she sounds like when she throws her head back and starts singing. It's like such an embodied presence.
We talked a little bit yesterday about the difference between bluegrass and old time music, and we were discussing that bluegrass was sort of meant for the stage, sort of removed more from its like community context and more of a performance that women were pretty much entirely excluded from until the point where Hazel comes along and Alice. When she kind of dances between those, and I think when she begins, it's not even a term that's used.
Right, and I mean, she talks about like church music, and I think that's what she accounts for her voice coming from church. But also, she grew up in a musical community. Like, music was embedded in daily life and social life. And so when she gets to the city, she finds that in house parties, but it's not in the same way as like the familial, like at the old home place playing music. And so if she wanted to continue to play music, she did have to subject herself to, the bars and, going to house parties. But yeah, I think that's also tied in with genre too, because I think it was so culturally embedded that she's not thinking in like terms of genre. Yeah. It's more about this is community music.
It goes to, people who talk about meeting her at the time and her suspicion of like, why are you interested in this? This is something that we do as a community. And sort of maybe her discovering, oh, people are interested in this.
Yeah, people who are not part of her, like these city kids,
Yeah.
like into this music that I play.
Yeah, there was a line in the book, something about, and I can't quite remember because it's been a little bit, maybe you guys can help me out here. About like singing, when she was a kid in church, like how playing the message, what was important in the delivery of like the hymns and singing in church. And it kind of reminds me that when you hear her when you listen to her sing in all of her messages.
And her songwriting.
Her songwriting, it's very message driven. It's, that's what's important, and she's just belting it out. And it's beautiful, but the message is what you hear more than any flourishes, really.
Well, this theme of community-oriented music, really embedded, also brings to mind how, like in her interview, she talked a lot about how when she moved to the city, she was so lonely. And she's there, all of her family is there, but the context is so different living in a city. And she said somebody could die in your neighborhood and you wouldn't know that they had died, and nobody told you. They didn't spread news the same way. And just her trying to figure out, who these, like dealing with that loneliness on the one hand, but then also meeting people who are so intrigued by her, which I can imagine, I don't know, like doesn't really make you feel like you're in community because people are sort of drawn to you for I don't know, for reasons that might make you a little uncomfortable. They want something from you, or they're kind of fascinated by you. But she talks like about kind of grappling with all of those difficult feelings as a migrant. But also, like she'll talk about that and the struggles, but then in the same stories will say, like, being in Baltimore liberated her. And I think we hear that in the music. She's singing about themes of what it meant to be a woman in the mountains, what her mother's work life was like. You can imagine, she had 11 children. She sings a lot about economic displacement, which of course is like the reason so many people are moving from West Virginia and other places in the mountains to cities. And so that there's a kind of loneliness in it, but also like processing and making sense, and this person figuring out who she is in the world, which is just so beautiful.
Yeah. And like, old time music is just a great remedy for isolation and feeling alone in a city. If you play old time music and you're at a jam at a party, you don't need to be talking to people. You all know the same songs, so you can pick them up. And it's like a really nice way to feel close to people, even if you're from a completely different place.
Yeah, I think there's something she says in one of the, maybe it's the book, maybe it's Mimi's documentary, but she says that I was just this backwoodsy little girl. That's quotes, still partially tied to these old ideas and constraints. But also I wanted to be this liberated woman who needed to be free of those constraints. And I think she finds that in Baltimore, but also, is really missing home. She's meeting these people like Seeger and her friend Elise Proudman, who like kind of show her the way in some respects in the city, but also really value her for her music and her talents and her ideas and her creativity. And so she appreciated getting that validation of her culture and her talents from us, people who were not of her same community. So I feel like that's a tension that's kind of
she's kind of working with in a lot of her life. And it seems like writing plays this big role, songwriting plays a big role in helping her find her voice and finding a sense of self. The way she talks about writing is just so beautiful.
And so her time at Continental, is that when she first starts to sort of awaken to a labor perspective? Is that accurate to say, or what did that enter in for her?
Yeah, so that's the first time that she is a member of a union, and she talks about being in this factory with, well, almost everyone else is also from the mountains, is a hillbilly, and that makes a big impact on her. That's a place like on the factory floor where she is around her community, and they all are part of the same union, and they can file grievances, and they are allowed to complain about work and try to make it better. And so she talks in the documentary about how important that moment was of seeing workers who were empowered, which certainly becomes like one of the major themes of her work, is like what does it mean for working class people to fight together, work collectively to change society and make life better. And I mean, she has like, her critique of capitalism is so sharp.
Yeah, it's so sharp. I mean, Working Girl Blues, like one of her hits, and so beautiful, like just such a perfect song. When the Lord made the Working Girl, he made the blues. It's just like, it's amazing. But she wrote that. She said that the idea came to her while she was at work, and she had to step away and scribble it down. And she actually taught the chorus to her coworkers, and they would like sing it together on the line while they were working to themselves. It's like that's how integrated music is into her life, and also that's sort of the relationship between music and labor that she sort of fleshes out throughout her career in her songwriting, and actually in her life as a worker, juggling being a touring musician and working at this canning factory, and then becoming a working musician and investing her whole life in it with the understanding that there are some sacrifices, and a lot of those sacrifices are about money.
She's going on like these tours with Alice and still like holding down a full-time job, which is wild. And then at a certain point she decides that she's just gonna live pretty humbly and just be a musician. And I think that's when she moves into her apartment in DC. Yeah, I mean she was working through most of her music career and later in life.
I think she got a telegram from her boss while she was on tour. He was like, "You need to get back to work." And she at that point said, "No, I think I'm quit. Telegram back. I quit." I hope that telegram is in the archive somewhere. But yeah, I mean, on this theme of working class protest music, she's working at Continental Can and is a part of that union herself, but then her brother dies of black lung disease, and that I think is another moment that's really an awakening for her. Her brother was a coal miner his whole life, and she sat with him and watched him as he was dying, and then wrote this just incredible song about experience, about how someone could work their whole life and die in poverty with this horrible disease. And so this black lung, she wrote it in late 60s. And then soon after, she wrote the Mannington Mine Disaster. Is that the title of the song?
Yeah.
Mannington Mine Disaster, which is a disaster, a coal accident in 1968. 78 miners died in that explosion, and she went to perform for the widows of those miners. And she had written this song, and she talks about looking out into the audience and seeing the widows and seeing their children with them. And she felt like it wasn't really her place to sing this song until she sees them and she feels, she knows her audience. And she sings to them. And that song is, I encourage you, if you have not heard it, to look it up and pay attention to the lyrics, because it starts with an analysis really of the propaganda coming from the coal industry
and that the coal industry tells mothers, you've got to raise up your boys to go work in the mines like their fathers and to bring home a big paycheck. And then the narrator ultimately sings to remember the 78 miners who were burned alive, and basically is beseeching, other mothers, don't send your boys into the mines. And it's just, it's kind of, to me, it seems like a clarion call. At that moment, it's a really important moment for miners who are organizing and widows who are organizing for their rights in the coal fields and access to black lung entitlements. And so she was a part of these movements that were happening on the ground.
And I know probably most of you are not familiar with our podcast, but we have talked a lot in past episodes about how difficult it is to write a political song about the current political moment. And oftentimes those songs are quite bad or corny or don't take a stance, or, we have a lot of critiques. But Hazel, I just feel like no one does it like Hazel. And I think part of what makes, she's a beautiful writer and can say a lot in not a lot of words, but I think what makes it so poignant for her is that she's embedded. These are like people that she knows. She has family that experienced black lung, died of black lung, and she is embedded in these social movements. And so she can speak from personal experience, but also from kind of an empathetic perspective as well. But yeah, we've been revisiting her catalog this past week, and I just have been struck all over again about how incredible her, especially her political songs.
Yeah. And she writes about labor, she writes about war, she writes about social alienation, heartbreak, migrant workers, all in a way that you can just see how much sorrow she had for, how much empathy she had for people, and how sad she was for people who went through hardship or alienation, and just her delivery and her writing. She truly, I cannot think of another person who is as gifted at capturing those emotions and then providing sort of a release valve for you if you are enraged at your working conditions, or if you are sad, or if you're going through something similar. Yeah.
Let's talk about her feminist songs.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start? Well, I guess I'll just say that she writes about this, and her vision of women's liberation is tied up with class, critiques of class inequality, and also racism. So that it's kind of all embedded together. So I feel like it's a radical feminism that really comes out in her. So I'll just say that is
Yeah, we've all there are certain narratives that circulate about kind of the shift into the women's movement and the exposure that Hazel and Alice gained to the women's movement being like a sort of encroachment on their old time and bluegrass work, as if these things are separate. The audiences may have been separate sometimes, but we see sort of with excitement the broadening of their audience as second wave feminism comes into play, and there's these new audiences who are interested in their work because of this sort of layering of women's voices, because of this interest in women's issues, and it's just very exciting and beautiful to me, and I think to all of us, that these are very, as Emily said, these are very class-based critiques. This is a very intersectional feminism that she's excited about. Yeah, I really just want to put a fine point on it, that it wasn't scary feminists coming in and invading the bluegrass scene. These things are a little more layered than that.
Even though her biographer Bill One seems a little scared.
I wasn't gonna say that.
Yeah, because there's kind of this idea of feminism is out there on the East Coast, and it's college educated, middle class women, all white women, not connected to places like in the mountains. And of course that just wasn't true, because like the amazing thing about feminism in the 70s is, actually I was thinking when Alice was talking earlier about how people found old time music, and it was just they were looking for one another, and you just had to find it and then be part of those communities. And feminism was similar, at least in my own deep research into feminism. There wasn't like, I mean, there's a great book by Finn Inca called Finding the Movement, and it's about how women just started looking for one another. They didn't need a movement to tell them they were oppressed. Like, they knew that. It was just like, a movement helped them to put language to it and to do something about it and to like ultimately change society for the better. And so Hazel and Alice are right in the middle of that, because it's the 70s, they're performing, they're touring. They talk about being, I think they were in Boston, and they were there for a bluegrass concert, but then all of these feminists, and like Boston, like those feminists were like radical feminists. Bread and Roses was there. These are like feminists on the left, a lot of them, and they show up to hear Hazel and Alice, right? It's just like a part, like people were finding one another and making sense of the world. And Hazel and Alice were giving, like, I would consider them part of the soundtrack of second wave feminism. I worked a lot with women miners who were breaking down barriers in the 70s to get jobs in the mines. And I told them that I was going to be part of this, and they were like, "Oh, please say hi to Alice and tell her how much we loved listening to I think it's the 1973 album, and they do a cover of a Carter family song. What is it? Hello, Stranger." And they, like, that's one of their, they love that song, they love listening to it together. And then, of course, Hazel eventually would write a song for the coal mining women for the documentary that was made about them. So, I mean, like, it was part of the spirit of the times, whereas I think it gets written about, like, they're card-carrying feminists, and you're either one or you're not.
Yeah, but, I mean, we talked a little bit separately from today about Hazel's song, "Don't Put Her Down, You Help Put Her There." People are nodding their heads. This is like a pro-sex worker song. It's like, it's about being in the honky-tonk and seeing these other women who were being denigrated by the men around her and saying, like, you don't get to say that about her. It's just very powerful. She didn't mince words. And I was thinking, going back to where we started with Hazel changing her age, I thought about this last night, and I was racking my brain. There's someone else who did that. I remembered this morning, Zora Neale Hurston. Yeah, she would sort of, as she came, she's like in the Harlem Renaissance and a little bit adjacent to it. And she's a folklorist herself, Black Southern folklore, specifically in Florida, but also like the global South, Haiti, etc. There's a lot to say about her, also a wonderful fiction writer. When she moved north out of Florida, sort of changed her age a little so that she could get to Barnard College, so that she could work in the anthropology department, so that she could go in and get this funding. And, you know, it's incredible. And I think the kind of incredible parallel here is like, it is just a very explicit way to take agency. To be like, on the one hand, I think, as Jesse, you said yesterday, there's some pain there. There's like some, I'm processing this separately from my life over here, I think, implicit in that. But there's also this incredible power in saying, like, no, my life at this age is starting here, and I'm gonna go on and take my life forward from that. And yeah, again, very powerful person.
Yeah, I just want to mention the performance on, is it Woman Alive or Women Alive?
Yes, Woman Alive.
So 71, I think? That's a little later. Well, so they perform on this PBS show that was a Ms. Magazine show. And I think that shows how embraced, or how embedded they were in the women's movement. But it's also just incredible footage. There's some in the singer from the song, Pickering documentary. And they're just wearing these great, like, full peasant dresses. It's very of the era, but I recommend looking that up.
Should we talk about the Southern folk cultural revival project?
Yes.
Some more?
We talked about it earlier. You're the expert in it here.
Were you on tour with Hazel?
Yeah, well, I did see some photos, I think, of you on that tour with Hazel and Alice. Maybe in Pikeville or Blackie, around Blackie, I'm not sure. Somewhere in East Kentucky. You're on a dirt road.
Yeah, so just for those who don't know about it, so the it's a mouthful, so I have it written down here. The Southern Folk Cultural Revival Project. It started in 1966. My understanding is that initially SOC, which is the Southern Student Organizing Committee, wanted a fundraiser, and they worked with Anne Romaine, who then talked to Bernice Johnson Reagan, who came out of the Albany Singers, and SNCC from Georgia. They talked to them about starting this festival, as Alice talked about earlier, to bring white and black Southern folk singers together on stage. And at least in the early iterations, they would, and Rich, I'm curious if you were ever a part of this iteration of it, but they would narrate a history of the South. And I'm a historian, so I just totally eat this stuff up. And so it was, music and storytelling and trying to give, especially young white Southerners, a story of the South that was liberating and that was about like how to fight for justice and how to be in solidarity with people, in particular Black people in the South. And so 66, 67, these are important years in the civil rights movement. Basically, SNCC has told white activists, you need to start organizing among the Southern white working class. And so Anne Romaine is part of that surge, part of that movement, with her partner, Howard Romaine, at the time. And so they start, but then I think maybe a year later, they keep the festival going, and then it kind of develops in its own ways, as we heard about earlier from Alice. But just bringing together all of these amazing musicians, and it seems like so I'll say, Hazel describes going to every major Southern university campus at that time, which is incredible that they were going to universities. And she talks about it in the interviews with such pride and such confidence. Like she was on those college campuses influencing these people. And she doesn't say like, she's somebody who didn't go to college, but she didn't. She didn't go to school very long. And I think that's just pretty amazing. When she talks about that being an important moment for her politically. So it was a form of political education. So she was kind of awakening to these political movements, the student movement in that period, and she says that really informed the kind of songwriting that she was doing. And I think we see her become more, she was always a part, singing about working class experiences in life, but we see it more politically charged once she's on the tour.
Yeah, Alice, the way Alice wrote about it in the book is white and black musicians dramatizing and celebrating common working class heritage of struggle against poverty and injustice through music. And I was reading something else, unrelated, recently, but there was Bernice Johnson writing a quote in there. And she said something like, I didn't realize, or I didn't understand how anyone thought they could bring people together without a song. Like music has to be at the core of it. And it occurred to me that both Bernice Johnson Reagan and someone like Hazel and many of the musicians on that tour, white or black, came out of a musical culture where music is embedded, whether it's church music, it's music you sing and play at home. And I just wonder what were those conversations in the band? Alice writes about Doc Wallace and Elizabeth Cotton having a sweet friendship, and Elizabeth But yeah, there is a kind of shared culture, like cross racial lines, a shared culture that I think they were celebrating and narrating through song on that tour.
Yeah, and it's true, we don't get their conversations in the van. That would be cool. But we do have recordings of a lot of those performances at the UNC archive, and actually a lot of them are, I don't know a lot actually, I'm not gonna say that. Some of them are digitized. I did a project on Mabel Hillary and Johnny Shines a while back for their Miami Blues Festival performance in 1973, I think. Don't quote me on that, I think it was 1973, and they were both on the tour. Mabel Hillary, a Georgia Sea Island singer, who wasn't really like in the front lines of the civil rights movement in terms of protesting, but who was writing protest music and who was on that tour. She's performing. I really love Johnny Shines' recordings from that collection. He is just a really brilliant man, and he has this platform to describe his vision of like a transnational blues music as like an ethic, as a morality, and also as a form of music. Just like very smart, very moving, and yeah, I mean it's cool. It's like you think this stuff is buried, but we have it. We could listen to it.
And Hazel also talks about how, so they were in the bands having conversations, but then also on stage, like they were sitting in a semicircle, and she describes it as kind of a return to like those Baltimore house parties where people are in community and playing together instead of the musician performing to an audience, but there's more of a community orientation.
Yeah, she seems to always be trying to bring it back to the community, whether it's talking to coal miners' wives, or in her work going to college campuses,
Performing at union rallies.
performing at union rallies, just sort of performance and the community, always trying to kind of like make that circle complete.
Yeah, this happens sometimes when we're recording because we try not to make a map of how we're going to we get all excited.
We could talk about her influence.
Oh,
Anything else?
maybe we haven't talked about Florence Reese and Sarah Ogan Gunning and Olabelle Reed and Candy Carawan, who was here earlier, who invited Hazel to be part of a workshop at Highlander Center in 1972, I believe. And Sarah Ogan Gunning, do y'all know who Sarah Ogan Gunning is? Yeah, look her up. She wrote the song "I Hate the Capitalist System," one of my favorites. She was somebody who was singing. I think we can see Hazel as part of a longer legacy of women in the mountains, especially balladeers who were singing about the union struggles in the places where they lived. And so people like Florence Reese, of course, who sang "Which Side Are You On?" who wrote the song and sang it. And Sarah Ogan Gunning also sang about UMW organizing in the 1930s and after. And so Hazel was part of this workshop that Candy and Guy Carawan organized at Highlander and with a few other people. I think Nimrod Workman was there. And then Folkways ended up releasing that, I think. Maybe. I might have that wrong. Or maybe that was
It was Rounder.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's two Folkways recordings of Rounder.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot in terms of just this long tradition of women. It's like Ella Mae Wiggins coming out of the textile worker strikes in the 1920s, Anna Jackson, Sarah Ogan Gunning, Florence Reese, and even though Hazel, I mean, she did meet some of them later, there is this tradition, and I imagine just like there's so many women we're part of, it's just these are the ones that we actually know of and we hear their music, like that women were sharing, their stories and the stories of their communities and uplifting one another and sharing a message through song.
Yeah, I would be very curious to know more about, interactions between Hazel and Olivelle Reed, since they were basically in the same area. Olivelle was her family's from North Carolina, and then moved up to north of Baltimore, and their family had the New River Ranch. But Olivelle is another person who does write songs from a migrant woman's perspective. And so sort of her and Hazel have a little bit of a parallel existence, and they definitely knew each other and were both at that Highlander workshop, I believe. But I don't know much about what they talk about and some of their shared experiences and conversations.
We also know a bit about her interactions with Florence Reese, who wrote Which Side Are You On? Because she performed for Reese's 85th birthday party. She plays Freedom's Disciple, I think. And, says that the song is influenced by her and by working people everywhere. And Florence Reese liked the song. Which is very beautiful.
Yeah, and I think we can also talk about the influence of Hazel and Alice. And there's lots of professional musicians in the documentary, like Lori Lewis, Alison Krauss, the Judds, one of the Judds, talking about hearing Hazel and Alice for the first time. And the Judds have a great story because it's in Berea where I live. But they go to a used record store in Berea, and one of them, I think it's Naomi, picks out the record. It's the Folkways record, the first Hazel and Alice record. She talks about seeing these two women on the cover and just being like totally struck and sort of like, I need to hear this immediately. And then hearing these two women sing together, especially with like Hazel's kind of like high lonesome, beautiful, powerful voice. And it was like, oh, two women can sing together, we can do this. And so it being very influential for the Judds, Naomi and Wham, to go on and sing. But there's also, lesser known or people who had a sort of hybrid, a little bit of professional music, but not totally like someone I worked with in West Virginia, Elaine Perky, she had, I think, her most well-known song is on Smithsonian Folkways. I think it's Best Protest Music or Best Labor Songs. But she was from West Virginia. Her husband was a UOW coal miner, and she wrote songs for the Pittston strike, and was very well known in her community in southern West Virginia. And she was very inspired by Hazel and Alice, and Hazel was a huge influence on Elaine. And Elaine says these things that feel like they can almost be Hazel quotes, like Elaine said something like, so when I interviewed her, I asked her her birth date, and she said, well, I was born on this date, but 1981 is really when I was born, because that's when I really started like grabbing things about the world and like singing labor songs and like, speaking out. And I think she really credits Hazel for that inspiration.
And there's such West Virginia artists, right? Like I now more fully appreciate that. I lived in West Virginia for 5 years, and people love Hazel Dickens and Elaine Perky, and they loved West Virginia. And Hazel talks about how one of her favorite songs that she ever wrote, she might say it's her favorite, is West Virginia, My Home, which is a beautiful song, and people in that state just adore that song and feel, she sees like West Virginia is such a beautiful, it's like heaven to her, and she just, it's just a beautiful song about home and longing for home, and also I think the tragedy of people being pushed out of their homes because of the collapse of industry. And so there's always that kind of heartache under it, which I think could be heard as nostalgia, but I think when you understand the context of like, what does it mean to lose your home because you lost, like your whole entire family lost their job and lost like access to the industry that paid the bills.
and they capture that so well.
Yeah, I think people say all the best songs about West Virginia, including West Virginia, my home, are, from the perspective of people who don't live there anymore.
Yeah.
I'm like, they want to be back there, wish they could be back there, country.
Yeah. Almost heaven.
I don't think you've ever even heard the answer.
No.
I don't think it's actually that way. No. Great song. Yeah, I would say that West Virginia, my home, in West Virginia is second only to country. Like country roads. It's a deeper cut. You have to really be from West Virginia to get that.
I feel like we can end with a quote.
Yeah.
No, I think this is great, and yeah, the quote that Emily pulled, I think is where is that?
Yeah. So, there's a very sweet, or a great quote that we thought we'd end with from Hazel. That pretty much sums it up, I think.
Alright. If I have a religion, that's it. To take what I have and be able to share it with somebody that needs it. If there's any religion in my life, it's for the working class. And I want to be that way as long as I have breath.
A lot of times we end on Sophie reading a quote and I feel like crying.
Not today.
I guess we could talk about this, but I guess we could take questions.
Yeah, we don't have to put you on the podcast if you don't want to be on it.
I have two questions. One, and thank you for this very informative discussion. Did Hazel marry or partner or have children? And that's just something I actually don't know about her. I know her music. And then two, just sort of tangentially related. I think Dr. Wilkerson was mentioning like working with women coal miners, and I was just curious about that work.
Yeah, so on the first question, we have to say she didn't hate men, even though she got it. That's just a joke. So Bill Malone was like really worried that she.
It didn't sound for her on that. Don't worry.
She married Joe Cohen, who I think was a taxi driver and just, I don't know. I guess it's like a man about town who went to the house shows.
Okay.
She met him there. And so they were married for 3 years.
Okay.
And then she had a long-term relationship with Ken Irwin?
Yeah.
Of Rounder Records.
Okay.
So, yeah, but she sings so much about heartache and also like ditching men and just like, okay,
Trying to get her back.
Yeah.
Yeah. She talks a lot about the experiences of her sisters who all got married and had kids and had like kind of difficult lives.
Yeah, so she never had children. And yeah, I mean, just one of the songs that's coming to my mind is A Few Old Memories, which I think is such a beautiful song. And Dolly Parton covers it, and I think it's also a gorgeous cover. But yeah, so she has really beautiful songs about her love life and those sorts of things. But the coal miners, yes, I'm working on an oral history project with women coal miners who were among the first to break down the barriers in the mines in the 70s. So women go into the mines around 75, 76, and they love Hazel Dickens. Like, that's the connection here. they really loved her music. She sang for them several times. I think she went to one of their conferences. Definitely these women were at the Pittston strike. Hazel was on the picket lines there. She did a benefit concert with Billy Bragg. There was a group of women who called themselves the Daughters of Mother Jones, many wives of coal miners, but also some women miners were working with them as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Hazel captured something about many of their own, like they identified with her and her music in a really beautiful way. Thanks for asking.
All right. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Say that. Oh,
Can you please introduce yourself?
I must have forgotten.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nameless.
You're the female Bob
My name's Sophia Bromowitz. I work at Smithsonian Folkways. I used to be a professor of archive theory and American studies focused on American music and the idea of the folk as it was created in the late 19th century. I also help produce this podcast. I'm a writer and a friend of these people.
I'm Emily Hilliard. I'm a folklorist at Berea College in Kentucky, and I worked as the West Virginia State folklorist for 6 years. And I also have co-founded a feminist record label called Spinster.
I'm Sarah Bachman. I'm an artist, illustrator, musician, currently a wage worker, and a friend to us. Today.
Yeah. And I'm Jessie Wilkerson. I'm a historian and writer. I live here in East Tennessee. I teach at the University of Tennessee, and I'm working on a book about women. It's a women's history of Appalachia from the perspective of working class women. So I wrote a chapter about Hazel that hopefully will be coming into the world in 2027, I think. And while we're talking about writing, I do want to shout out Emily's amazing article about Hazel Dickens. What's the title of the article again?
It's making a living by the sweat of her brow.
Yeah, Making a Living by the Sweat of Her Brow in Smithsonian's Folk Life. Amazing, right? And you can find it online, and it's so good.
And you will be able to find Jessie's piece on Hazel soon too. I don't know how much I can say about that.
Yeah, right, 2027, yeah, probably.
As part of
Look for the book. The book is titled "They'll Never Keep Us Down," which is, of course, a Hazel Dickens song.
Yeah, it helps give us a lot of background. So,
Yeah, thank you all so much. Feel free to move around.
What was the name of Hazel Dickens' documentary that you mentioned earlier?
It's hard to tell the singer from the song. It's from Apple Shop. It's by Nene Pickering, and it is available online for free.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think you can get on Folk Streams and on YouTube.
Thanks, everyone.